There is a drawer in a museum that contains impressions from a dead civilization. Not paintings, not inscriptions carved into temple walls. Small flat stones pressed into wet clay by hands that have been dust for 4,000 years. The animal on each stone is precise. The signs beside it are deliberate, and no one alive today can read what they say. I found them while researching something else, ancient trade weights standardized across a civilization larger than Egypt. The weights led me to the seals. The seals led me to a silence I have not been able to leave. The weights are what led me there. I was not looking for a lost civilization. I was tracing the standardization of ancient trade measures, trying to understand why certain ratios appear across cultures that had no documented contact. The Indus weights kept coming up. Small polished stones cut to precise ratios, distributed across settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers. I pulled the records. The weights led me to the seals. The seals led me to a city I could not stop thinking about. That is how this investigation began, not with the mystery, but with a measurement. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were not settlements that grew from a central point outward the way most ancient cities did, accumulating walls on top of older walls until the original plan was buried under centuries of improvisation. They were designed. The British Museum notes that major settlements were laid out on a grid pattern with drainage and were clearly organized by central power. That sentence contains two details that deserve separate attention. The grid means someone decided how the city would be arranged before the first brick was placed. The drainage means the infrastructure that no one would ever see, the channels running beneath the road surface, was built before the streets above it were laid. You cannot build the drainage after the street. The sequence is fixed, which means the people who built these cities were thinking in the correct order years before the first family moved in. Consider the math. A settlement planned on a grid with underground drainage and standardized weights requires administration before it requires residents. Someone has to survey the land, establish the street lines, dig the channels, bake the bricks to a consistent size. That coordination does not happen by accident. It happens because a structure exists that can hold a plan across the time it takes to execute the plan. The Indus Valley maintained that structure across 500 settlements over a territory larger than the contemporary civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia combined for approximately 700 years. 700 years. The United States has existed for less than 250. The streets ran straight from one end of the city to the other. Below them, the drains ran deeper. Wells at regular intervals went down to water that did not depend on the rains arriving on schedule. Seal makers in workshops carved animal figures into flat steatite stone. Traders moved goods along river routes connecting settlements across the full breadth of the civilization. Cotton textiles, shell ornaments from the coast, carnelian beads from the eastern hills, copper from the west. Standardized weights that allowed a merchant in one city to measure goods against the same ratio as a merchant 300 kilometers away. The same weights, the same ratios, everywhere. That is not the record of a people finding their footing. That is the record of a world that had already arrived and had been maintaining itself for longer than most civilizations have existed. The official understanding is that the Indus Valley was a Bronze Age civilization, roughly contemporary with the Old Kingdom of Egypt, which declined sometime after 1900 BCE due to a combination of climate shift, river changes, and population dispersal. Reasonable. Consistent with the physical evidence, except for one detail that the official account does not resolve. We cannot read a single word they left behind, not one confirmed word from a civilization of this scale and duration. Sumer has left us tax records and love poems. Egypt has left us the names of every pharaoh and the contents of their correspondence. The Indus Valley has left us signs on thousands of objects distributed across an entire civilization, and not one of those signs has been decoded. That asymmetry is what this investigation keeps returning to. The old man in the room remembers when the signs were everywhere, moving freely on goods between people who understood exactly what they meant. He was not a scholar. What he knew was the texture of a working city, the straight streets before sunrise, the click of polished weights against stone during a transaction, and the silence that followed while both sides accepted the number, the smell of wet clay from the workshop 2 alleys over, the river routes bringing things from places he had never been and sending his work to places he would never go. The city had an internal logic that did not require explanation, because everyone inside it shared the same frame of reference. The weights were the weights, the signs were the signs. The streets went where the streets went. He is not describing this to preserve it. He is describing it because his family is in the room, and the room is quiet in a way the city never used to be, and the only thing he has left to give them is the shape of what it sounded like before the quiet arrived. The Sumerians left us their arguments, their tax disputes, their court cases, their love poems, their letters of complaint about merchants who delivered substandard goods and then denied it under oath. Assyrian scribes pressed cuneiform into clay tablets that scholars have been reading and translating for over a century. We know the names of Sumerian rulers who died before the Egyptian pyramids were built. We know commodity prices in Babylonian markets. We know from a letter pressed into clay 4,000 years ago that individual merchants could be tracked, named, and held accountable for what they sent. The Harappans left signs too. The British Museum describes Harappan seals as often made of steatite, bearing several characters of the still unread Indus Valley script, usually with an animal image. Steatite is a soft stone, easy to carve precisely, and the Harappan seal makers used that precision consistently. The animals are not rough sketches. A bull carries its musculature correctly. A rhinoceros stands with the particular heaviness of a rhinoceros. The craftwork is confident. The signs beside the animals are deliberate. Most seals carry between 4 and 6 signs. Short, but short is not the same as simple. The same symbols appear on objects found hundreds of kilometers apart. That is not random variation. That is a system in active use across an entire civilization. The system has never been decoded. Not a proper name, not a number, not a single confirmed word. Researchers have applied statistical analysis, computational pattern recognition, comparative linguistics drawing on every known script in the surrounding region, and the debate has not been resolved. The official position is that the signs constitute some form of writing or proto-writing associated with administration and trade. Reasonable, supported by the physical distribution of the seals, except for one detail that no method has been able to cross. We do not know what the signs say. After more than a century of sustained investigation using every tool available, the channel is intact and the signal is lost. A seal maker in the city understood each mark the way a person understands their own name. He polished the steatite flat, carved the animal with a copper tool held steady by a practiced hand, then cut the signs beside it. When the seal was finished, it could be pressed into wet clay on a package of goods, a jar, a bundle of textiles. The impression told whoever received it something specific, who sent it, what it contained, who had certified the weight. The system worked because both sender and receiver shared the same frame of reference. That shared understanding moved freely across the full extent of the civilization. Modern researchers look at those same impressions and understand nothing of what passed between sender and receiver. The Harappans did not vanish without leaving evidence. They vanished while leaving messages we still cannot hear. By the time the seal maker noticed the change, it had already been happening for years. That is how slow withdrawal works. It does not announce itself. The first sign was a well at the edge of the city that required more effort than it used to, the water sitting lower than it had the previous dry season, and lower still the season after. Then a channel that had carried river water into the city, running slower than anyone could remember. The riverbank cracked in places it had not cracked before. Rooms in the outer districts stood empty, not because their residents had died, but because they had calculated the distance to somewhere more reliable and left. A 2025 study published in Communications, Earth and Environment found that after approximately 3,900 years before present, the Harappan civilization began to decline. while also noting that the precise causes remain debated. Nature Asia summarizes the same research as finding that successive major droughts, each lasting longer than 85 years, were likely a key factor in the civilization's eventual fall. 85 years is longer than a human life. A drought that outlasts the people who first noticed it does not feel like a drought to the generation born inside it. It feels like the permanent condition of the world. The water their grandparents described as reliable becomes a story about how things used to be. The story becomes the only form of water anyone can offer. The Indus cities did not fall like Nineveh falls. They faded as water, trade, and confidence withdrew from the streets one season at a time. The seal maker had fewer orders. That is not a dramatic detail. It does not carry the weight of a battle or a flood. It is the kind of detail that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you try to find the moment the city stopped being a city and cannot locate it because it was never a single moment. It was a sequence of absences, fewer traders arriving, fewer packages requiring a mark, fewer reasons for the mark to travel anywhere. The city grew quieter than it had been in his father's time, and the quiet arrived so gradually that for a long time no one named it, because naming it would have meant accepting that what was leaving was not coming back. He is back in that room. The family has gathered the way families gather when they understand that morning is uncertain. The seal is in his right hand, the clay is still wet beside him on the floor. Outside, the street is quieter than it would have been when he was a boy. Everyone in the room already knows this much. He begins with the streets. Not the streets as they look now, but the streets as they were when he was young enough to run the full length of them before the city was awake. Straight. Clean after rain, because the drains below did their work so that the surface above never had to carry what the city produced. He tells them about the wells, how the water came up cold even in the driest months, how drawing it in the morning was not a task that required worry because the water was simply there, as it had always been, as everyone alive had always known it to be. He tells them about the weights, the click of polished stone against polished stone during a transaction, and the silence that followed while both sides accepted the number, because the weights were the same weights that a merchant 300 kilometers away was also using, and there was nothing to argue about. He tells them about the seal. He has carried it for as long as his youngest child can remember. He pressed it into clay on packages that left the city and came back as different goods, copper from the west, shells from the coast, carnelian from the eastern hills. People he never met received the mark and understood what it meant. That understanding travelled farther than he ever did. The mark was the part of him the city's system could carry across distance without his presence. He pressed it into the clay, and the city's logic moved with it, arriving in places that would never know his face. This is where the Indus story separates from every other ancient story we know how to tell. A Sumerian in the same room, in the same condition, pressing a final mark into clay, would be giving his family something that a scholar could eventually read. An Assyrian's last tablet would enter an archive that survives in translation. The old Harappan presses his seal into wet clay and the mark appears clearly, and neither his family in that moment nor any researcher working 4,000 years later will be told what it says. That absence is not a gap in the archaeology, it is the archaeology. The gap is the record. He tells his family what the city sounded like when it was fully itself. Carts on the straight streets before the light was up. Traders calling prices at the weighing platform. Stoneworkers in the adjacent street. Each sound had a source, and each source had a reason, and each reason confirmed that the city still required work, and still had people willing to provide it. He cannot locate the moment when the sounds began leaving, because they left the same way the water left, gradually enough that each individual absence could be explained by something other than loss. A family making a private decision, a trade route becoming less reliable, a season drier than the one before it, and then another. He presses the seal one final time. The mark appears, an animal, a few short signs beside it, arranged with the same deliberateness they always carried. His family watches the impression hold its shape in the wet clay. No one in the room explains what it means. No explanation is offered, and none is asked for. That silence, the silence of a meaning held between people who share it without needing to state it, is the last functioning moment of the Indus Valley script in this room, in this family, in this particular chain of transmission. The pattern, when you hold it all together, is not subtle. 700 years of organized cities, standardized weights, planned drainage, long-distance trade, and a writing system in active daily use across an entire civilization. Then the rivers changed, the monsoons weakened, the droughts came in sequences longer than any living person could outlast. The cities did not fall. They became less necessary, one season at a time, until the people who remained were living inside a logic that no longer had enough water to function. The writing system dispersed with the people, not destroyed, not buried, simply no longer transmitted, because the civilization that had always transmitted it had broken into smaller communities where the marks had fewer and fewer people left who could read them. The streets of Mohenjo-daro are still there. Archaeologists walk them every season, measuring the widths, tracing the drainage channels running beneath the surface exactly as they were designed to run 4,000 years ago. The wells are intact. The platforms where goods were weighed are intact. The seals are held in museum drawers across 3 continents. The symbols are catalogued, analysed by every computational method the present century has produced. None of it has returned the voice. He carved the sign so his family would remember. 4,000 years later, we still have the sign. We just do not know what memory it was trying to save.